So what's your name and age?
Okay, I'm Dave Robbins. I was born in 51, so I'm 72 years old this year.
So Dave, tell me about the farming side of Hama Hama. We'll get to the logging side here in a little bit.
Okay, so this is what I wanted to talk about to you, Daniel, was the haying we
Hmm.
did when I was a kid, because I'm pretty sure we were one of the very last farms anywhere to be putting up loose hay.
Wow, really?
And it's really good. It's stuck in my memory, and I want to talk about it before it's gone, because it was different. People have been putting up hay forever, and it was always loose hay in various forms. And balers came along in maybe the 30s, I'm not sure. And
Hmm.
then by the 40s, they were getting perfected. And by the 50s, they were pretty decent machinery. And we didn't get a baler till 1974.
Oh, wow.
So I remember loose hay real well. And it was quite a process. By the it Doing loose hay got mechanized to a certain extent in around the early 1900s. And so I wanted to talk about this a little bit, but the first step to doing hay, of course, is mowing it. And a fun fact there is that the mower that we were using in the 50s and 60s was the same hay mower that my dad had been using in the 30s.
Wow.
Difference is he was pulling it with a team of horses named Barney and Duke. And by the time I come along, we were pulling it with a little farm tractor.
Oh, wow.
Because in the 40s, almost the whole nation switched over from horses to tractors.
Wow.
And the horses were pretty smart. Dad, I wished could have seen it, but Dad has told me they loved working, just like a retriever likes fetching a stick. They knew what was going on when you harnessed them up, and they knew how fast to walk to make the mower work right. They knew how far from the uncut hay to walk, and they knew how to do the corners. So the guy riding the mower didn't need to do much. He just hooked the reins over there, and I used to love working with teenage boys, but I would make you a bet that a draft horse is a little bit smarter than a teenage boy.
Hmm. Yeah, sure.
So anyway, by the time we came along, it was a two-man job. One guy on the tractor and one guy on the mower. And the mower was a cool machine. It had steel wheels, probably 4 inches, 4 or 5 inches wide, and maybe 2.5 feet tall, and lugs on them because the wheels provided the power to the cutter head.
Hmm.
And it had a wooden tongue, maybe 8 feet long, that you could either hook up to a team of horses or your farm tractor. Um, the power from the wheels went through a gearbox, through a clutch, and then to a little eccentric that ran a pitman arm that went back and forth like this, and that's what
Oh,
drove the cutter bar
sure.
in the cutting head. And so it made a beautiful little clickety clack sound. So the guy riding the steel seat there controlled the clutch and also the lever that raised and lowered your cutter bar. Um, we still have that mower. So it's a pretty cool old piece of machinery. So by the time I was doing hay in the 60s, we switched over to a, a rake that was a side delivery um, PTO driven rake. And assuming you could get your hay dry, then well, I actually want to say a word about that, because getting your hay dry was no given back then, and that's one of the big changes in my lifetime.
Hmm.
Is weather reporting back in the 50s and 60s was a pretty dicey adventure. In fact, the joke was, and it was true, that the weatherman could have put on his suit and tie and got on the 5 o'clock news every night and said, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow's weather is going to be very much like today's weather." And he would have been right more often than he actually was by trying to make a forecast.
Hmm.
And now weather forecasting today, it amazes me how accurate it is. So if you got your hay dry, then what you did, you hooked up your tractor to this hay wagon, which had steel wheels and a short wooden tongue. That again, that it's the same stuff that would have been pulled with a team of horses. And behind the hay wagon was maybe 8 feet wide, 20 feet long, and 4 or 5 foot tall sides. And behind that went a neat piece of machinery. It was a John Deere hay loader, hay picker upper. And it hooked up to that hay wagon with a short little hitch, 2 little steel wheels in the front that would steer, and 2 bigger steel wheels in the back that provided the power for it. It was maybe 8 feet long and 7 feet wide and maybe 9 feet tall, and it had a steep bed like this. And the pickup unit in the back was all chain driven off its own wheels.
Wow.
The pickup unit in the back, you'd straddle the windrow. So as you went
Sure.
along, it would throw the windrow of hay up into this steep bed, and there would be maybe 6 arms that would go like this, and they had tines on them maybe that long, and they would rapidly move that hay up the steep bed and dump it into the hay wagon. So it was mechanized to that extent. Before that machinery got invented, people would have to walk along with a pitchfork and throw it up
Wow.
into.
Yeah.
So then the cool part was, and this is what's worth describing, because you've all seen these old barns that had a track hanging out one end.
Sure.
And that track went all along the ridge line of a barn, and it stuck out maybe 8 feet, and it often had a little hip roof over it, there was a beam to support that extra piece. And along that track there was a little trolley ran, and it was probably not a big piece of machinery, maybe about this big, and it had 4 little wheels on it, went up and down the track. Okay, so then there was about a 200-foot long rope that was dead-headed on the front end of the trolley, went through one pulley that was attached to the Johnson fork, and then through another pulley, and then all the way down the length of the barn, through a small window there, and through a pulley, and then down to the last pulley at the base of a gate post or something, and then it would attach to either your tractor or your team of horses. Okay, so as the tractor guy is backing up, the guy in the hay wagon, which is parked right under that track that hangs out, he'd be pulling this thing toward him with the rope that's attached to the Johnson fork.
Mm-hmm.
He'd get near the end and he'd sort of slam it out to the end, because when it hit the end, when the trolley hit the end of the track, it would do a clever thing. It would dog onto the track, and at the same time it would release the pulley that was holding the Johnson fork. So then as the tractor kept backing up, the Johnson fork and that pulley would come on down to the hay. So the guy in the wagon would then stuff that thing down as far as he could, and the Johnson fork is maybe a 30-pound piece of steel. The tines are maybe this far apart and maybe this tall, and it had 2 handles on it with a connecting rod that went down to the tips, and it pulled 2 barbs up like this. And so it took a heavy guy in the barn, in the hay wagon ideally, and he'd stuff it as far down as he could and then pull both handles up and then yell, "Go ahead." There's a lot of yelling going on all the time, because the guys in the hayloft couldn't see the guy in the hay wagon, who couldn't see the guy on the tractor, right? And so then the tractor would start going ahead, and this Johnson fork and wad of hay that was about the size of a small car would start going up and up and up, and it would hit that trolley where the pulley would mesh into its slot on the trolley. When it did that, it would latch on there and release the trolley. So, it built up a little tension, and then boom, that would all happen, and the whole thing would go whooshing into the barn.
Sure.
So then the guy in the wagon would be paying out a line, about a 1/2-inch rope that was attached to these 2 handles. And when the 2 pitchfork guys in the barn would yell, "Okay," he'd take a rap on his hand and give it a sharp jerk, and the 2 handles would come down, the barbs would go down, and that entire wad of hay would go kerwhump. And it would, when the hay loft was empty, is probably about 12 or 15 feet from the floor of the hay loft to the track. So then the 2 guys would start moving the hay across, and the tractor would back up, and you'd pull the thing back and do it again, right?
Wow.
And I don't remember how many wagon loads of hay it took to fill the barn, but we would fill that barn to where it was stuffed to the gills, and there was just a little room for a guy to crawl back down the ridge line to go down the feed and chute. And of course, you'd
Wow.
feed it out in the winter by you'd have to crawl up there and throw it down the chute.
Sure.
Um, that was the process. And then in 1974, we got a horrible machine that I didn't like much. It was a 25-year-old International hay baler with a Wisconsin motor on it that uh, it, either the knotters weren't working or the motor wasn't working. But
Oh, gee.
anyway, that's when we switched over to baled hay.
Wow.
Uh,
So when you guys switched over to baled hay, were you purchasing it at that point then, or were you still doing it out of your fields here?
oh, the only time we ever had to buy hay is when it all got rained on and ruined,
Sure.
which happened fairly often.
Wow.
But
Yeah, yeah.
so yeah, and we never did huge amounts of hay. We just have a 40 acres of cleared hayfield here, just enough to keep a dozen mother cows maybe, and really that's just enough farming to be a problem, and not enough money to really. The only benefit from it is you get to sink your teeth into a steak that you know where it came from.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only benefit.
So my wife, as a backstory here, gang, um, I live about 15 minutes away from Dave here, and my wife worked on the haying team when she was a teenager,
Oh yeah.
and I think it would have been about 2003 or 4. It might have even been '02 is when she came down and worked with the crew down here haying. But when was the last time you were involved with haying here? Did you just do this last summer, or has it been even
I
further?
pretty well stepped away from it.
Yeah,
Tom runs the whole tree farm and the farm now, and but we did use all the local kids we could get when it was haying time.
yeah. And how long would that last during the summer when you had the kids out here doing that?
Just a day here and a day there. It was really only maybe 4 days total during the summer.
Yeah. And would you be working 6, 8 hours or longer than that, you think?
Yeah, that's about all because you really can't windrow the hay up till the dew is off. So
Hmm.
typically if you get it dry enough, you'd rake it or windrow it up by noon, start baling by 1 or 2 o'clock, and then you'd work till 6 or 7.
Yeah. Now, when was the last time that you used any of the old equipment that your dad had used or gotten it out and knocked the rust off of it?
It's just sitting there rusting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
The hay mower is undercover. Well, actually, so we still have the hay wagon, and that hay loader is a John Deere hay loader, and I have it's undercover too.
Sure. And the last time you think the wheels turned on it was,
Maybe 20 years ago,
wow.
I hooked it up and took it around the field
Yeah.
just for old time
Yeah,
memories.
sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So tell me about the logging side of the Hama Hama company. And I mean, if you have any recollection of the early history, anything you got, I'd love to hear.
Right. That's an interesting history. Uh, I forgot to mention one thing though about that hayloft.
Oh yeah. Huh?
There was a huge barn door in that end of the barn that you'd park the wagon under. It
Mhm.
was probably 8 feet wide and 10 feet tall, and it had enormous homemade hinges at the bottom. And the first thing you'd do when it was time to start loading the hay, you'd hook that to the tractor and back up. A couple guys would push on the top of it till it flopped out, and then they would just lower it down with that same setup.
Oh
That
sure.
opened up that whole. That was a big barn door.
Wow.
And then yeah, it was fun watching that hay go in, but it was a lot of work. All hay in is work, work, work.
I love the idea of that trolley you're talking about because it sounds like a mechanical slack pulling carriage kind of a
Yep,
deal.
it was a clever piece of machinery.
What year do you think that was made?
I'd say most every barn from that was built from 1900 to 19 30 had a similar setup. Our barn wasn't made till 1940, but they all had that overhead track and a big barn door, and they all had that same type of setup.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, the ingenuity.
A lot of ingenuity. And the logging I got to detail, it's just fun to think of how it's changed over 120 years. So yeah, the the history in this valley is pretty interesting. It was my great grandfather bought a big block of land around here in 1899. He'd made a pile of money and he lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, and his job was contracting to build railroad grades and lay rail. And the chatter was buy timberland in the West. Minnesota's played out. So he did, and it was kind of near the end of his life. He bought this land sight unseen, and just 6 years later, in 1905, he passed away. He wasn't really that old. So his son was my grandfather, and he was only 25 years old, and he had to grow up fast because he had 6 sisters and a mother, and he had to figure out how to be the man of the house.
Wow.
And part of that, I think it turned him into a real businessman. And he had quite a career starting sawmills here and there and worked with timber most of the time with sawmills and such. And that businessman gene passed me right by. I got the tree growing bug instead, which has been good for me. But anyway, in 1922, he took this block of land and decided the timing was right, and he got together with a couple of business partners, and they raised enough capital to actually form the Hama Hama Logging Company, which they incorporated it in 22. Right at that time, the Discovery Bay Logging Company had just wrapped up a 12-year job, and they were going out of business, and they were selling all their stuff. So grandfather bought everything they had: the rail, the cars, Loki's, donkeys, rigging, everything.
Wow.
It took a lot of stuff to run a company, and they brought it all down here by barge, and everything came in by barge in the 20s. And the first thing they had to build was a place where a barge load of stuff, whether it was beef for the camps or rigging or everything, they had a deal where a dock would they'd bring a barge load in at high tide, line it all up and hold it out, and as the tide dropped, the rails on the barge would line up with the rails on the track, and then they could drive it off with a Loki or pull it off with a donkey that was at the top of the hill. Their first log dump was at Hidden Cove, and the dock led right to an incline that had a donkey at the top.
Okay.
So everything that came to the logging camps had to get unloaded that way and get pulled up and then hooked to a Loki. And all the logs that came down on the cars went off on a double siding. And then one by one, the donkey would pull them off the back and lower them down this incline out onto the dock. And they'd poke the logs off, start forming booms with them. And then they ended up, for the second half of the job, they had the whole setup down here at the oyster company area.
Okay.
Okay. The job lasted 10 years. He had 300 men. They got 1,000,000 board feet a week for 10 years
Oh, wow.
with just axes and crosscut saws and steam power and some gas pot engines. They had little gas yarders. During those 10 years, log prices went down from $18 a thousand to $7.
Whoa.
And the 7 was, I think it was below their cost of production, probably by a fair bit. So they just gutted out the remainder of the job because they had everything in place to do it. But so the job ended up in 32, and they just let everybody go and started selling scrap metal, pulled up all the rail, sold all the cars, and the 30s were rough time on everybody. And then during during the 30s, we lost 3/4 of our land because of what I would call confiscatory tax policy.
Mm.
And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Cutover timberland was worth $1 an acre if you could find a buyer, and your annual property taxes were $1 an acre.
Oh, balls of
So
fire.
think about that. If let's say you own a piece of land now and it's worth $1,000 an acre, and your annual property taxes are $1,000 an acre, that's pretty harsh.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of companies, just like grandfather did, they just stopped paying taxes on the bulk of the land. That land then reverted to county ownership through tax default, and then it got taken over by the state DNR, and they manage it today as county trust lands.
Mm.
And the state actually does a pretty good job of managing their lands, unlike our Forest Service, who harvests by uncontrolled burns.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But anyway, the 30s, 40s, and 50s were really tough times, very slim pickings. You know what, though, Daniel? I want to step back. Before my great grandfather bought this land, there were people in this valley. I mean, there's obviously been Indians and Native Americans that were around here forever, but the first settlers came in here in the 1880s. And they weren't really actually here to settle, they were here to log. And they brought in oxen. And they logged 400 or 500 acres in this lower valley of old growth timber in the 1880s. And
Wow.
that was, I'd love to have seen that. That was obviously all cutting with axes and crosscut saws.
Yeah.
And they had to build nice level ox trails, skid trails, because they're not going to pull those logs up a hill. They had to
Mm-hmm.
design a nice trail that would lead to the salt chuck. But it's amazing where all they got. And we don't know much about them. I don't know where they came from or where they went. I don't even know their names, but we could always tell where they'd been because they left tracks. I mean, you could see their skid trails where they had to make a little through cut. They couldn't do a
Mm.
lot because all their little cuts were made with shovel and a wheelbarrow.
Sure.
They didn't have any machinery. But and you could also tell where they'd been by the age of the trees that
Yeah.
sprouted up after they were done. And that's why this area here behind you called Grandfather's Park, it's all dated from 1880s.
Mm.
So it's 140 years old now.
Wow.
And these redwoods they're only 33 years old, but in another 30 years, they're going to be as big as the park timber.
Wow.
So anyway, I backtracked there. So so this company was really pretty dead for the 30s, 40s, and in the mid 50s, grandfather wrote a letter to my dad and said, Bart, you got to move back here with your young family and either make a go of this or I'm going to have to sell it because it's bleeding me dry and it's probably never going to pan out. But why don't you try it? Why don't you move back here and give it a go? So dad moved here with his young family in 55, I think. His first living was commercial shrimping and selling wild Christmas trees, selling a little scrap metal. And there were a couple milk cows that had been here, and
Mm.
so we were always doing a little hay. And 57 or so, he got the oyster business rolling. And then in the middle 60s, he put a 3-man crew together and he started logging. He was logging about 1 million board feet a year for 4 or 5 years. And they loaded them typically with end hooks and a gin pole. So
Wow.
you'd skid the logs in with that D4 cat, and then you had to, rig your lines,
Mm-hmm.
dog in your end hooks, bounce them up over the bunks, and it was pretty rudimentary loading, but it got the job done.
So would they hook up the lines then somehow to the back of the cat
Yeah,
and use it to lift that? Wow.
yeah.
And then did you have like a tag line on each end to help kind of move
So the
it?
kid could jerk the lines out
Yeah.
or guide them a little bit, guide
Sure.
the log a little bit. Yeah, I suppose I wasn't paying much attention.
Sure.
Kid.
Well, being with these photos too, if anybody recognizes this Mac and or that international that we're showing in here, speak up and leave something in the comments.
Yeah.
And then there's a picture of poles leaving one of your dad's jobs.
Yeah, Dad got out a few loads of long poles up to 120 feet long.
Oh my
So when
goodness
we were
sakes.
logging some poles and I was bragging about 70s and 80s, he said, "Ah, no, you're not even close."
and and from that photo, that looks like we're staring at probably a six-cylinder gas engine that guy's got in that log truck.
Yeah. It's too bad there isn't a name you could read on it. It's, yeah. And at the time, the market was better to sell cants than round logs. They called them Jap squares,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they got exported to Japan. So he bought a portable sawmill, and there were a lot of little portable sawmills around. They called them tie mills because, in the railroad building
Oh.
era, people they needed millions of ties.
Mm-hmm.
8 by 10 timbers about 8 feet long. So there were a lot of these tie mills, and they were portable. It had an axle under it. We still have it here. We refurbished it in the 70s. Um, you'd fold the two ends up. That would expose a hitch. You'd uncouple the motor, set it in a dump truck, hook up the hitch to your pintle hitch on a dump truck. It had about a 48-inch blade. It had a self-feeding thing. So then
Wow.
you would, him and his three-man crew would drag it to what they were getting in the mid 60s was patches of small old growth that
Okay.
was so small, like this, that nobody would, the old timers never bothered with it, or it was just in an odd corner where their rigging didn't reach it.
Sure.
Wasn't worth building a little. So there were enough of those patches that kept him going for most of the 60s. And okay, so it took two pretty strong men to offload these cants because they were green timbers, probably anywhere from 8 by 8 to maybe 12 by 14. And I don't think they were very long,
Wow.
but they'd offload them. Okay, the D4 cat would have dug a trench for the flatbed truck right near the sawmill. They'd offload these cants and build them up into a pile on a skid right next to this trench. When it was a load, they'd binder it up and then back the flatbed, probably a single axle flatbed, down into the trench to where the bed was level with the skids.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'd take that D4 cat and shove this whole load over onto it. Then they probably had to pull the flatbed truck up out of the trench and off
Mm-hmm.
he'd go to the big city, right?
Wow.
And they'd just keep on milling wood. And so it was, you can imagine the slabs, they didn't try and get anything out of their slabs. So they were
Right.
probably pulling off slabs that were like that thick and this
Yeah.
and just I remember as a kid seeing these huge slab piles around. Um, that was that era of Dad's logging, and then when I started to work, I went to work full time for Dad in '72,
Okay.
and we pretty much got started logging right away thinning. We were mostly just thinning because there
Hmm.
wasn't really any the timber that had sprung up since the railroad days wasn't old enough to do anything but thin it. Well, we pretty much thinned all during the 70s, and we were using a little John Deere, like a 440 John Deere bucket loader on tracks and pulling that same arch around.
Hmm.
So I was cutting timber and I had somebody skidding with that. We just used self loaders.
Yeah.
And we did that during the 70s. I don't know when we bought our first wheel skidders, probably in the late 70s. And then we started working a few little clear cuts into the mix in the
Yeah.
late 70s. That's when my cousin Robbie Dorr moved up, and we logged together for a dozen years. And it was all chainsaws and chokers and self loaders.
Yeah. Hmm.
Pretty simple. Kept it simple. And then in about '88, we used Burley Creek Trucking a lot for the self loaders, but we just go with whoever, and it was slow. You know, maybe a load a day would be big production for
Mm-hmm.
us. You know, and sometime in the 80s, we actually started renting feller bunchers. We rented a 755 John Deere one year with a Hurricane head on it, a shear. It
Yeah.
could cut like an 18-inch butt, 18-inch tree. And then I rented a Bobcat that would cut a 14-inch tree. And those were fast and good for small wood areas or thinnings. And it was in 1988 that we said, let's try a log loader. So I went into this, I forget the name of it, in Everett, and we bought an old um, Husky 180 with a Detroit diesel, and it was mounted on an old gas engine, 2-axle international truck. Loaded with that, it was old when we bought it, and loaded with that for a year and a half, and I thought, I like loading logs. And we had a lot of timber out ahead of us by then. I said, I started shopping, I'm going to buy a new loader. I found I looked at Hood and Prentice and ended up with a Barco. Bought it from Cascade Trader. I drove that old International right down I-5, pulled it into their yard. They took the Husky off and mounted the Barco on there, and I drove it home. Probably a week later. Takes a while to mount them.
Yeah.
And both of those machines had stick controls,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and I've loaded a lot of different trucks with those over the years. We kept that Barco. We still have it, and that Barco cost $60,000, brand spanking new in 1990. And I've probably loaded millions of dollars worth of logs with that old thing. Never done a thing. It had a Cummins engine in it, and we just never had any troubles with it. I think I remember loading you a few times back when you had that blue International truck.
Mm-hmm. There's actually some oh, if you guys go back in the video archives, I've got some videos from about 2012 and 13 of Dave loading my International and my Kenworth with that that log loader too. So there's a few videos of you on there.
Cool. Yeah, I could load pretty good with that old Barco.
You're very proficient and very quick with it. I was surprised with the fluid motion going on in that cab.
It was a quick machine. It was a fast machine. And then in 2015, I did something that I don't I don't really regret, but man, it was a hard transition. I I decided it was time to buy a Doosan, a real shovel
Uh-huh.
on tracks, a serious log loader, and of course joysticks. Nobody stick controls. What's
Yeah.
that? No, those were long gone.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, that that first week I tried to load logs with that thing. It was literally a nightmare.
Yeah, I bet.
I mean, it was a nightmare. I especially the release button. I'd
Mm-hmm.
have a log sitting there that I was all set to lay on this bunk, and I'd hit the release button, and the logs would just jump out of the grapples like they were possessed. And instead of going here, it'd be over on the other side of the
Sure.
truck, or it would jump completely off the truck.
Sure.
The, the truck drivers were sitting over there backing up a ways, and they were going, "What's the matter with old man Davy? Did he catch a case of epilepsy or what?"
Gosh.
It was the hardest week of my life. I went from being fast and smooth to becoming a complete moron.
Oh boy.
I never did get proficient with that, but it'll happen to all these young bucks that think they're good at loading in one way, and eventually a new technology will come along,
Sure.
and you'll have to teach those old dogs a new trick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So now when you took over like the timber harvesting side in 72. At what point did you guys go from having like a cable skidder to maybe a grapple skidder or something like that?
Probably bought our first skidder, which was a line skidder,
Mm,
in, I'm almost sure, 76 or 77. I think it was just before Robbie Dorr came.
mm,
Ran it, I bet it was in the mid 80s that we upgraded to a grapple skidder.
okay.
And we've had a grapple skidder ever since.
Mm,
So yeah, I loved loading logs, but I enjoyed cutting timber. I did all the cutting until we eventually switched over completely to feller bunchers,
mm,
contract feller bunchers. We've never wanted to own one, and I was never that great a cutter. The best cutter in the Northwest is probably Randy Bruff,
mm.
and that man could cut circles around me. He was really good, but I could get him on the ground most of the time. And the goal during the 80s and 90s, especially, we started contracting with Kevin Morris to skid to yard with his yarder,
Okay.
and he was used to parking a truck mounted loader under his yarder because he'd started out that way working with his dad.
Mm,
And nobody today would know how to do that, but Kevin did. He showed me how to do it and make it work. And we parked that. I said, I'd like to sort and load under your yarder. And he said, okay, that's good. I'll get another job for my loader and I'll come up and yard.
well, that's cool.
And it worked out really well. I developed a great relationship with Kevin Morris. He probably logged maybe 6 different units for us during the 90s.
Mm,
And he's a good operator. He's still driving truck for Sierra Pacific now.
okay.
Um, but the goal was always to work towards what I call fat man's logging, where there's nobody on the ground,
Sure.
not a chainsaw in sight. It's all mechanized. And basically, the L&I rules or the L&I rates forced people to mechanize that way
Yeah.
because your logging rate went from $17 a thousand, $17 an hour for employees down to about two if you
Yeah.
were fully mechanized. So Jimmy Goodpasture bought his big old Barco with a Cato 1000 head in '04, 2004. And that's when we really achieved that goal of mechanized logging.
Mm,
We'd contract the bunching to maybe various guys, Steve Val or Forrest McCulloch, and then Jimmy would process. Jimmy also could fall and process right at the stump.
mm,
And we did that several years, and it worked pretty well. He'd process, he'd fall and process, and you'd tip him toward the landing, which seemed counterintuitive. But then you'd have this pile of tops that were all even
mm-hmm.
and vary from big logs down to little ones, and then you just grapple them in, and then I'd sit on that Barco and just sort and load. Man, we'd get out. You could do a load an hour with that.
Wow.
Yeah, we did really good with that. Um, if you kept the yards short.
Sure.
But so it was, yeah, Danny James on the skidder and Jimmy and me. We logged like that for a few years.
Mm.
So that got us up to about the present day. You got any other questions?
I was curious, throughout the years, what was the biggest timber sale that you guys took on here on the farm?
Um,
Like as far as you could go by how many board feet or how many acres. Because not too many people are real aware of how you sustainably harvest timber off of a tree farm, like what y'all have here. So, were you doing it in 5 acre parcels per year? Were you doing tens or twenties or?
yeah. Well, it started out like I said, there wasn't much merchantable timber to work with.
Mm-hmm.
So we started out doing small clear cuts, maybe 15 or 20 acres,
Okay.
and gradually worked up to where we figured we could cut about 40 acres a year
Okay.
sustainably.
Mm-hmm.
Um, oh, that was another funny story I was going to tell you is sometime in the 70s, I asked Dad a funny question. I said, so all those areas that you logged in the 60s and you were cutting cants, did you ever replant there? Because by the 70s, we were doing pretty serious forestry.
Sure. Sure.
And Dad looked at me like I was a little bit mentally challenged. And he said, son, all during the 50s and 60s, at the end of any given year, and all the taxes were done and everything was done, we did not have two nickels to rub together. The very idea of paying some money to buy a seedling and put it in it would have never occurred to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so my grandfather was the same way. They never replanted in
Sure.
the 30s. Never a thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, grandfather, his generation, he said that he considered what they were doing to be the one-time extraction of a non-renewable resource.
Really?
Yep, because they could
Huh.
count rings just as good as we can,
Uh-huh.
and they knew that 350-year-old timber wasn't going to come around in any realistic time, right?
Oh, sure.
So he just did not figure it was a long-term thing in forestry.
Wow.
And by the time Dad was doing it, he could begin to see that it was more long-term. But by the 70s, everybody could see that, if you cut 1/70th of your tree farm every
Mm-hmm.
year, you're going to be able to do it forever.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, it takes kind of a patient person with a long-term view to be able to sit in your forest and drink a rum and coke and just watch your trees grow.
Sure.
But I love tree farming.
Yeah.
I just like the way they grow.
That's cool. Did you ever have somebody from the outside help you with getting a grasp on how to manage it efficiently or do things differently, or did you work it out just on your own?
No, and I I dropped out of college because college was just for me it was a waste of a perfectly good mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to work with Dad.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing we did in the early 70s is we hired Guy Lucinian, who was a Shelton forester, a really top-notch man. He was about halfway between me and Dad in age.
Mm-hmm.
He worked for Simpson, then he went out on his own running a forestry company. And um, he really helped us. I mean, he helped lay out sales, figuring out how to do everything as far as forestry work.
Okay.
And so as I was following him around, I was very aware that that was what we were paying him was my forestry school tuition,
Sure.
basically. We hired him for maybe 5 years, and then it's like, okay, Guy, we really don't need you much anymore.
Hmm.
But we brought him out here 3 or 4 years ago, just before he passed away,
Hmm.
and I drove him around here, and he loved seeing all the trees and how they're doing.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any one of these? I, I use the term sale, but that's not accurate because this is a tree farm. So, but any one of these plots that you laid out over the years that really sticks out in your mind as being a fun one to do? They're all fun.
It's funny. I used to know, you name a year, I
Mm-hmm.
would have told you exactly where we were logging in that year.
Mm-hmm.
And, because you have to, once you're done logging it, the work starts. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you really have to do a lot of follow-up in them almost every year for the first 5 years, and then again around age 10 and so forth. So you get to know the unit pretty well. But now I've lost track of a lot of them.
Sure.
I mean, they're all fun.
Yeah.
Some are not doing that great. I
Hmm.
Some of them I didn't take all the right steps to get them going well, and some are doing really, really pretty well. This patch of 33-year-old redwood is probably the funnest experiment I ever did. It's just been, I planted redwoods almost every year after this. In 1990, I planted these in 90, and I planted them every year for about the next 20 years.
Hmm.
And I learned about where they would really perform and where they wouldn't. And on a lot of
Hmm.
our really poor site land, they don't even keep up with a native Doug fir.
Oh,
But
wow.
on this, where they have happy feet, they're incredible.
So what's the average height and diameter?
I don't know the average diameter, but Tom said he measured a couple that were 135 feet tall.
Wow.
And that's that's almost 4 feet a year in average height growth.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, you see, if for all those watching this, in the background and corner of the cameras, we're amongst this stand. This is pretty incredible.
Yeah, what you should kind of scan through it. This is about
Yeah.
one
Let's
acre,
have
and
a
and we had to start thinning it at age 20 because they grew so fast. Um, we were we started taking out the ones with double tops and stuff,
sure.
and we're still thinning away on it.
Working this tree farm, um, did you ever get hassled badly from DNR or any of that when it came to permitting or buffers and all that, or were they pretty decent to deal with?
Yeah, we don't really have time to go into that, and you don't want to see me get red faced and have steam start coming out my ears and all that. We, with between the oyster business and our gravity water system and the steep and unstable rules and the salmon and stuff, I could probably go on for hours about how well I got along with Big Brother and what a
Sure.
wonderful relationships I developed over the years.
Yeah.
You really don't want to go there, Daniel.
Okay, I won't. Out of out of all the people you've worked with um, in all your years out here on the farm and working with the seafood company and the logging and all that, who stands out the most? I mean, in my short time here, Jimmy Goodpaster stands out the most to me, but I hadn't been around it all that much. I mean, Joe Faggio was here, and Danny James when I hauled for you, but
Yeah.
but I'm sure you've had some characters come through.
Oh man, I've put loads of logs on so many different truckers. I've Wayne Cusick and Roger Fazzola were
Sure,
two of our main ones for a while. And when we first got that log loader in '88, we had some old guy that was about Keith Satterthwaite from Shelton, and he was ready to retire. And he was so fussy about his truck. If I just banged that truck a little bit, he'd like, holy mackerel, you might break my scales or something. Those old guys, they taught me how to be gentle loading logs.
sure,
And but I know we had a great relationship with Kevin Morris and the good pastors, and
yeah,
yeah, and the guys I really partnered with, Robbie Dorr and then Kevin Lenting, logged with them each for about 10 years.
yeah. And you guys just kind of did a little bit of everything on the job site, or was it pretty specific? Like, um, you'd cut timber and then load the trucks, and Robbie would run skidder, or how'd that work?
With Before we got a loader, I'd cut the timber, Robbie would skid,
Mm-hmm.
and we used self loaders.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I started loading, we either contracted with somebody to bunch it, or Robbie did some cutting too.
Hmm.
And if it was steeper, like where Kevin Morris logged, we'd usually hire a crew of cutters.
Okay. So on those jobs where um, Kevin would do them with the yarder. Like, um, how big were those units that he was doing?
40,
Okay.
40, 50 acres sometimes.
So that would pretty much be in one shot your year's goal
Yep,
then. Hmm.
yep. Typically, for my whole career, we ran somewhat older equipment, and we would just log for maybe 6 months of the year,
Yeah.
maybe seven, and then just park it.
Oh,
And
that's a fun way to
me
do
and
it.
my one, I usually only had one logging partner, and then we just do odd jobs the rest of the summer.
Yeah.
We usually log during the winter season,
Hmm.
partly because prices are higher, and partly because there's not much else to do around here in the winter season.
Sure. Sure. Huh. So now these days with logging, is it still a 40 acre a year yield, or are they cutting back on the logging here on the
No, Tom's
land?
added a lot of land.
Okay.
Yeah, Tom's added a lot of land. He keeps a couple of big crews going, and he logs more like, I don't know, 50 acres a year at least, I think, and then he picks up a lot of side off-site contract
Hmm.
jobs. Keep the crew Keeps the crew going all year long that way.
Hmm. Do you have a specific year where you guys had a lot of fun with what you were doing, like in terms of people you worked with that really sticks out? I mean, I think that'd be real. Your decision to cut out college so you could work with your dad, I think that's amazing because there's not too many people that get to do what you got to do. So,
It was it was a good life for me. And my no brother good-in-law Danny James, he did the same thing. He logged with his dad. They had
mm,
a neat little niche contract logging business that picked up small offsite, small jobs and made a good living at it.
mm.
So yeah, I've worked with a lot of pretty neat guys over the years.
What's the biggest change that you've seen with forestry, or I don't know, the logging, the contract side of it that has been a good thing overall?
Well, the move toward mechanized logging is good. There's obviously a lot less injuries in the industry, um, and you get better production,
Hmm.
and it's safer.
Yeah,
But I'm glad that I have memories of logging the old ways. I would have loved to have gone back and seen the railroad coming up and down this thing, or gone back another 40 years before that and listened to the bull whackers gently encouraging the bulls to move a little faster,
sure.
the oxen. And logging has really evolved over the years, and
Yeah.
it would be nice to time travel and stuff, but you can imagine the way it was. But I'm glad I lived through the days when it was not fully mechanized. It was pretty good, good honest work.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Out of something else too that comes to mind, Dave, is with the changes that we've seen over the years with how things are done. What would you say the biggest change has been that you really regret seeing with um, just the direction, I guess, that forestry's gone in, or maybe the way things are handled with sales? I mean, anything that comes to mind. I'm just kind of curious on what your thoughts are.
No regrets, man. That's the saying today, right?
That's perfect.
No, it's been a good life for me. Yeah. No, it's all good.
And then tell me about what you're working on now. You've got a patch of timber that you're thinning out,
My little retirement
your
project.
retirement project.
Yeah, that keeps me active. Patch of young alder.
Yeah.
Um,
So how many acres are you working through and managing these days?
I'm just sitting in the shade of an alder tree sipping on a rum and coke and watching them get bigger.
Yeah.
I mean, they're pretty much, like I say, it takes a patient man to watch a tree grow.
Yes, it does. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about this.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and you're one of the men that I enjoyed working with over the years.
Well, I appreciate that because I feel the same about you. So you, I started with um, Marty Nakano, and then hauled for
Oh,
him for a little while,
oh yeah, okay,
and then came down, and when he uh, when he folded up, um, or went back down and was logging back down south, I came and hauled for you on the tree farm here. So
yeah,
yeah, right at the beginning of my log hauling career.
that's
So
right.
yep, it's been fun, hasn't it?
Yes, yes, it has.
Well, you enjoy your day, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, so we're doing an addendum here and adding in some photos we found. And the first one is of a picture of a big steam donkey that was logging my grandfather's era in the 20s. And they had two logging camps, one on each side of the valley, uh, 3 or 4 miles up from the canal. And they usually had two sides working like this. And um, they even had a big Lidgerwood skidder, which was a 400-ton machine, and it was the cat's meow for the day. It was the big time thing.
So that photo with the men standing there next to that steam donkey, that came from Bill Parsons, but what all were they using on that side? They had
Well, they of course rigged wooden spar trees,
mhm.
and this was a Darius Kinsey photograph. He came out and visited our operation in the mid 20s, and he had about 18 photographs. And on the back, on typically on the photographs, he wrote the date and who and his name. He was very good about identifying everything. And he said, it said Hama Hama Logging Company operating two slack lines, one steel tower skidder, one high lead, and five gas cold deck donkeys.
Wow.
And Bill Parsons gave us this one, but we ended up getting all 18 Kinsey photographs, really high quality photographs.
Oh, that's amazing.
Um, And this one is of, it's near one of the logging camps, but I think the camp is behind the photographer.
Hmm.
And this shows the tracks with a little speeder, and he had the flunkies and the cook come out just to take a picture of them. And it was daytime; all the guys were up working.
Do you remember anybody ever talking about when Darius, or it was his brother also that did photographs, right? Am
No, I don't think his brother, but his
okay?
wife was a huge helper. She did
Okay.
all the printing
Then
and stuff.
how much did they charge people for these photographs?
I don't know how he made a living. He did charge for the
Yeah.
photographs, and now Whatcom County Museum has rights to all Kinsey's photos.
Really?
So that's where we went to
Okay.
buy them all. And this one is really a high quality picture of the booming grounds at the mouth of the river, and that operated from about 1926 to 32.
Did anybody ever talk about how many million board feet would leave out when they would raft those
I don't know how
logs?
much they fit into a raft,
Okay.
but I know they brought maybe one or two train loads of logs down almost every day. And it was a lot of logs. They million board feet a week.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. And then these other three photos of also from the mid 1920s were
Hmm.
of the Girl Scout camp, and the man logging here was named Max Latzel, and Max and his wife Ava Latzel ended up running the Eldon Hotel for my grandfather.
Really?
And then when everything went bust in 1932, they went down to the Skoke Valley and became uh, dairy farmers.
Huh.
And that's who the Tozer's family came from.
Oh,
Their
really?
their kid, there's how'd that work anyway? They married into the Tozers.
But what now you talked about this before we got the camera rolling, but what was Max's story?
Oh, Max is an amazing story. He was a German boy at age 14. He hopped on a ship in Germany and got off in the first port they came to, which was Port Townsend. He didn't speak a word of English, and he walked up to the first farmhouse he found, and it was a German couple, and they taught him how to farm and how to speak English, and that's how he got his start in America. And here he was logging with an old, I think it's a Holt, Best, and they were skidding logs right across Highway 101 with that.
So
And
that picture with the car is what now is
that's
101?
right on 101. That's the
Wow,
highway right by the scout camp. And then when they got them down to the waterfront, they'd scoot them into the water with a gin pole.
that's incredible.
And yeah, cool photos. He logged there for probably about a year.
Okay.
He was really a horse logger, but that ground was too steep for him.
Now, at that time, that land didn't have anything to do with the Hama Hama company.
It was company land at that time,
Okay.
and it was out of the way for the railroad to get to.
Oh, sure.
So that's why they hired a cat logger to
Yeah.
do a portion of that. And then later on, the family donated it to the Girl Scout camp.
Yeah, cool.
So here's how the Girl Scout camp happened. My grandparents were named Helena and Harry Robbins, and they were born in the 1880s. And Helena was, she lived through the era when women didn't have the vote, but they did learn how to be very influential. Mm-hmm. And she was the one who really was the push behind a Girl Scout camp. She always was a big believer in the benefits of Girl Scouting and that it gave the girls a skill set they might not get otherwise, plus gave them a big sense of self-confidence, which is so important for all young people. And so she knew how to pull strings behind the scenes, and she was a big woman, not fat at all, but she always wore a really long dress and always kept a great big garden. When I was a kid, I thought she was like 7 or 8 feet tall.
Sure.
But anyway, she knew how to pull strings, and she convinced Harry to donate a parcel of land. Well, Harry was not the sole owner of the Hama Hama logging company, not by a fair bit. He had to take in investors and shareholders to help raise capital to get the thing off the ground. So he was a businessman, and in his mind, he wanted to set it up as a legitimate sale, and that worked pretty well. What he did, they took the property was a mile and a half of waterfront and 500 acres of uplands near it. Wow. And the price was $10 an acre. Yeah. Think about, changed a lot in 90 years right now.
Sure.
But that was full fair market value at the time.
Wow.
And actually, the only reason it was priced that high is because it still had a substantial amount of timber on it. So at the same time he put that sale together, Harry and Elena personally donated the $5,000 to the Girl Scouts Association so they could afford to buy it.
Wow.
So essentially it was both a sale and a gift, because
wow.
that's a question I've had over the years. And actually an interesting addendum is you fast forward about 4 decades, and in the mid-70s, Girl Scouting was way down, enrollment was down, their revenue stream was down, and they were hurting financially. And the Girl Scout Council, I think, is situated in Seattle somewhere, and it's some pretty high-powered people. And Dad got wind of it that they were going to sell the camp on Hood Canal because they just couldn't afford to keep them all.
Oh, wow.
And he called him and said, you know, if you're selling this just because you're strapped for money, you might think again, because there's a lot of timber value on there. And he got him in touch with our forester friend we had in Shelton named Guy Lucinian. And but it wasn't an easy sell because the mindset of those people in Seattle was that logging was a dirty word.
Oh, sure.
And I mean, really.
Really dirty.
Yeah. And it's a mindset that continued to, bottom line though, they did get a small forestry program going, and they didn't ever have to sell any of their camps.
Yeah,
which was nice. But that mindset really came to the fore in 1990 when the Spotted Owl Wars started.
Sure.
Oh, small communities, rural logging communities, and sawmill towns all across the Northwest were just being brutalized when the Forest Service shut down, and the people in Seattle were absolutely heartless about it.
Sure.
There was one headline in a newspaper that's kind of burned into my memory, and it said, nobody should feel sorry for the plight of the loggers because they should go the way of the buffalo hunter of the 1880s.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's like they don't know where their paper towels come from, but by golly, they vote.
Yeah. Wow. That's unreal.
And they outnumber us, Daniel, about 100 to 1. So I think I got off track there. I looked back and the caboose is completely derailed.
Yeah, that's all right. That's all good. So logging in a way saved the Girl Scout camp on the Hood Canal.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And they've been on a really nice, slow, sustainable forestry program ever since the late 70s.
So would you say with the camp and their acreage and all that, they do a 10-acre parcel every year maybe?
About 7 or 8 acres every 2 years.
Oh, sure.
Which is a neat program, and it gives them a steady little cash flow.
Yeah, that's great.
That's actually when I first met Mike Doig. He'd bought one of those 7-acre sales.
Oh, yeah.
You know Mike?
I do know Mike, yeah.
He was just back from Alaska and trying to get his foot back in the game here. And anyhow, he logged for them that one year and then ended up buying a logging truck.
Okay.
Hauled for Beckevar's the rest of his career.
Wow. All right.
Great guy. I've met a lot of great people in this industry.
Yeah, a lot of humble folks in this industry. Anybody else you can think of that comes to mind?
You know, the earliest log truckers I had were sole owners. You know, Wayne Cusick, Roger Fazzola.
Yeah.
I really applaud you for the interviews you've done. I wish you'd been doing this 40 years ago and you could have, Ernie Dahlman, Bill Bolander, Bill Parsons. There's so many names I could name off that would have been cool to get recorded.
I wish I was doing it 40 years ago also.
Yeah.
Mercy. Well, Dave, thanks again for stopping in so we could share some of these stories. I could hear some of these stories. How's that?
By way of wrapping this up, Daniel, you know this is true. We all have a timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Our days are numbered. The big guy has a plan and it'll unfold in its own good time. And so it's good to reflect now and then. And looking back for me, I loved falling timber. I loved loading logs. But especially now that I'm a little on the older side, I find that I really like growing trees.
Yeah.
And it's enjoyable for me to know that a lot of the trees I've planted are going to far outlive me, especially the redwoods and the sequoias that might live for centuries.
Sure, yeah.
So cool, huh? That's about all I got to say about that.
Okay, well, we'll wrap it up then here. And thanks again for your time and sharing all this with me, Dave, and everybody else out there.